After having done that long question, let's now do a couple of short questions. Okay. Hard Tiles recorded a profit of 1,20,000 in the accounting period, which just ended using marginal costing. The contribution upon sales ratio was 75%. Material costs were 10% of sales value, and there were no other variable production overheads. Fixed costs in the period were 3 lakh. Okay, so when I say I was using the marginal costing. So profit here is contribution minus fixed cost. What was the profit? The profit was 1,20,000. Okay. Profit was 1,20,000. Contribution we don't know. Minus what was the fixed cost? 3 lakh. So can I safely say that contribution will be equal to 1,20,000 plus 3 lakh is how much? 4,20,000. Now contribution upon sales ratio was 75%. So contribution upon sales is equal to 75%. So 4 lakh, so 75% is what? 75% is 4,20,000 upon sales, which means my sales value is going to be 4,20,000 upon 75%. कितना हो जाएगा? 4,20,000 upon 75%. 5,60,000 will be my overall sale. They have asked me the value of throughput. Throughput is sales minus material cost. And what is the material cost? Material cost is 10% of sales value. Material cost is 10% of sales value. So that will be 5,60,000 into 10%, which is 56,000. So throughput accounting is sales minus material cost, which is 5,60,000 minus how much? 56,000. 5,60,000 minus 56,000. 5,04,000 is my throughput. So this is a question which basically involves some mathematical jugglery. It's not tough at all. It's just that it expects you to connect certain points and then arrive at the final answer. Okay, now we have to understand two specific ratios in throughput accounting, and other three specific ratios in throughput accounting, which are the throughput per factory hour or the return per factory hour, the cost per factory hour, and the throughput accounting ratio. When there is a bottleneck resource, performance can be measured in terms of throughput for each unit of the bottleneck resource. So throughput per factory hour or return per factory hour is throughput per unit divided by product's time on the bottleneck resource. This tells me that if I work for 1 hour, how much throughput do I generate, assuming that time is my limited resource. Cost per factory hour is total factory cost divided by total bottleneck resource time available. This tells me if I work for 1 hour, how much cost do I spend? And throughput accounting ratio is return per factory hour upon cost per factory hour. Okay, let's discuss the meaning of each of these ratios in detail. So, for example, see if labor is my limited resource, I don't have too many labor hours, labor time is limited. The contribution per unit for product A is 20 and for product B contribution per unit is 30. Okay. Contribution per unit. If I make 1 unit of A, I get 20. If I make 1 unit of B, I get 30. But to make 1 unit of A, I need 2 hours. So when I work for 1 hour, for if my labor works for 1 hour, how much contribution do I generate? I can generate a contribution of 10 per year, 10 per labor hour. If I'm making product B, 1 unit of product B gives me a contribution of 30. But to make 1 unit of product B, my labor has to work for 4 hours. So for every hour that he works, I get 7.5 per unit. So if labor was a limited resource and I had to maximize my returns, I would pick that product in whose case the per hour contribution is the highest. Okay. So this is contribution per limiting factor. Okay. So let me write it down. If labor hours were my limiting factor, ठीक है, if labor hours were my limiting factor or constraint, I would want to use labor hours in a way such that I get max return from putting my labor to work. ठीक है. Now, when my labor works for 1 hour in 1 hour for product A, when my labor works for 1 hour for product A, I get contribution of 10 per hour. And when my labor works for 1 hour for product B, I get contribution of 7.5 per hour. So I would want to maximize my returns, right? And if I want to maximize my returns, I would ask my labor to spend time in making that product, which is giving more contribution for every hour spent. And which product is giving more contribution for every hour spent? Product A. So this is how I will decide which product to produce and which product to delay or discard. What is return per factory hour? If factory hour is my limited resource, return per factory hour is throughput per unit. Throughput is another word for modified contribution because you don't subtract labor cost. Throughput per unit upon divided by product's time on the bottleneck resource. This tells me that if I work for 1 hour, how much throughput do I generate? What is cost per factory hour? Total factory cost divided by total bottleneck resource time available. That is, if my labor works for 1 hour on the bottleneck resource or whatever the limiting factor is, how much cost do I spend? And return per factory hour is divided by the cost per factory hour gives me my throughput accounting ratio or TPAR. It tells me how much return can I get after spending $1 worth of cost. If TPAR is 2, return per factory hour is 2, that means I get a return of $2 by spending a cost of $1. If I am comparing to decide which product should be made, I must compare their respective TPAR. The higher the TPAR, the more is the return per unit of the cost spent. Like here, you had a ranking कि if I make product A, my contribution per unit, I already know, but time is my limited resource. So I wanted to calculate the contribution per labor hour. And when I calculated the contribution per labor hour, I realized that product A scores better than product B. TPAR tells me that for every rupee spent, what is the return that I am generating. So if I am deciding between products, I should go with that product which has the higher throughput accounting ratio. And see, numerator is the return, denominator is the cost. If TPAR is greater than 1, that means returns are more than the cost. If TPAR is less than 1, that means returns are less than the cost. Your returns from the product are not enough to recover all the cost. Such a product you should not produce. When ranking products made within the same factory, it is sufficient to look at their return per factory hour figures. However, if ranking products or divisions across the company, it would be suitable to look at TPAR figures to reflect difference in cost between factories. See, if you're talking about one unit or one factory only in which multiple products are made, the cost per factory or denominator will be the same in all cases. Because numerator is total factory cost, denominator is bottleneck resource. एक factory के लिए वो same होगा. But when you are looking at two or three different factories and you are comparing the output of each, then you should have the cost per factory hour in the denominator and compare the TPAR. This method is not without its own set of criticism. It concentrates on the short term when a business has a fixed supply of resources and operating expenses are largely fixed. However, most businesses cannot produce products based on the short term only. The one of the bigger criticisms is that when you are calculating throughput assumes that apart from material cost, every cost is fixed, and it is thinking about things in the short term. The problem magnifies in the long term because in the long term, labor is not necessarily going to remain a fixed cost, and it concentrates on the short term. When a business has a fixed supply of resources, in the long run, these parameters might change, and it is difficult to apply throughput accounting concepts to the long term, where all costs are variable and they vary with the volume of production and sale or another cost driver. So, as other items also start changing, the idea of throughput doesn't really hold a lot of meaning because now more costs apart from material costs are variable in nature. But if I were to, talk about it in simple terms, TPAR is contribution divided by fixed cost basically. Fixed cost is your denominator, cost per factory hour. Numerator is contribution. So if contribution is greater than fixed cost, accept the project. We said TPAR is greater than 1. TPAR numerator is return, denominator is cost. Basically fixed costs in the factory. So if I were to look at TPAR from a traditional accounting lens, traditional management accounting lens, I could replace my numerator, which was return, which was basically throughput. I could replace that with contribution. Denominator, which spoke about other fixed costs in the organization, can be replaced with fixed cost here. And if contribution upon fixed cost is greater than 1, naturally, that means contribution is enough to recover the fixed cost. You should accept the uh, preparation of that product. Otherwise, you will have to discard that particular product. And in case 2, in case 2, if contribution upon fixed cost is less than 1, that means contribution is less than fixed cost. That means you have to reject the proposal. Okay. Now, if I tell you that there is a person called Sahil and Nauman, Sahil has 57 out of 100, Nauman has 62 out of 100. It is easier for us to decide that Nauman's marks are better. But because both are out of 100, I did not even have to look at the denominator because it was the same. When I look at both of them separately, I look at Sahil who has 57 out of 80 and Norman who has 62 out of 100. Then I realize that if the denominators are not the same, I will have to divide 57 by 80, 62 by 100. I will get relative performance and then I will be able to comment on who is better. Similar thing is what we were trying to discuss here. When you are talking about products made in the same factory, the denominator, that is the cost, is the same. So you don't really need to calculate TPAR. You can only calculate the return per factory hour or throughput per factory hour. But when you are looking at products made in different environments, in that situation, what you will have to do is you will have to calculate the TPAR because the costs are also important in this discussion. Now, question 3, 4, 5, and 6. 6 is something, which has to be done with limiting factors, not right now. Question 3, 4, 5 are your homework. I want you to attempt these three questions, each of which will not take, question 3 and 4 will take 2 minutes each. Question 5 will take a little longer, maybe it will take 5 to 6 minutes. It's a question that expects you to apply your mind carefully. Do the three questions in your homework. We'll discuss these tomorrow first, and then we'll move on to the full-fledged discussion on limiting factors, which is the next topic. Okay. चलो, thank you so much for your time.